And you see, what I'm curious to know is, can the ambassador himself say today on national TV live that he personally is profoundly sorry for the rape of Mindy, profoundly sides against China,
I'll let you respond to that. We do recognize that acts of cruelty and violence were committed by members of the Japanese military, and we are very sorry for that.
But the memory of those who suffered,
but the memory of those who suffered,
I personally last long.
But that's not entirely correct, because for the apology. The apology.
Did you hear an apology?
I don't know. Did you hear an apology? I didn't really hear the word apology.
Okay, so Leslie?
Welcome to everybody. Thank you for coming tonight. And before I introduce Humberto, our speaker tonight, I wanted two quick reminders. Turn up your cell phones, please. And also, I want to remind you that we have one more event after tonight. John Willis will be speaking here on April 11th. So you might want to put that on your calendars, too. I am pleased and honored to be introducing Humberto Ramirez. His commitment to his art, to his teaching here at Landmark College and at the Vermont College of Fine Arts, to his role chairing the Landmark Art Department, as well as to the larger culture, is astounding and admirable. He helps faculty and students see the big picture, where art and community intersect, where art and history intersect, where language and image intersect, where theory and practice intersect, and where our differences and our humanity intersect. I've had many conversations with Humberto, and I've had him visit my class several times, and each encounter with Humberto challenges and enlightens me. He cares so sincerely about so many important educational, artistic, and social issues, and he can articulate why we should care as well. On a more personal note, I've appreciated getting to know Humberto and to feel his support for my writing. I feel his support for the practice of all artists is a way of recognizing the vital importance of art in all of our lives, as a way to see and to improve the world. Humberto is a multimedia artist working in painting, video, and curatorial projects. His work is shown online as well as at traditional venues such as art galleries, museums, and film video festivals. His work has been shown throughout the United States, as well as in Latin America and Europe. He has lectured on topics including postmodern theory, cultural criticism, psychoanalytical theory, and globalization, among others. His works have been reviewed in major art publications, such as Art Papers, Art in America, Art News, and the New York Times. We are very fortunate to have Humberto on our faculty, and we are fortunate tonight to have Humberto as part of the speaker series. We should be prepared to be stretched and enlightened. Welcome.
Thank you, Leslie, and Jeff as well for inviting me to this lecture series. I appreciate immensely your words, Leslie. I, as you know, value you as a colleague greatly, so it means a lot to me. I hope that I can live up to that introduction. It's a little bit intimidating, but a word perhaps here about what you just saw. What you just saw is a video. It's an excerpt from a 10-minute video. That was only 3 minutes, by an extremely talented Vietnamese-American artist. Her name is Hong Anh Truong. And this video is titled A Measure of Remorse. It's an extraordinary video. I had the privilege of curating her into a show in New York at the Chinese American Arts Council. And it is a video that I think is perfect for framing our topic this evening. It is perfect because it brings to our attention the intersection between the body, language, race, nationalities, and ultimately the immense complexities of the strategies of representation. Our talk this evening is going to come back to the issue of language and representation over and over again. It is at the core of what I want to talk, and it's hopefully something that will be relatively new, at least for some. The video specifically addresses the video takes as a platform, if you will, a very specific event. And this event occurred in, or through, I should say, a news program. And it basically brought together the ambassador of Japan, the author Iris Chang, and Elizabeth Farnsworth, the PBS newscaster, or anchor, I should say. It sought to examine the atrocities committed by the Japanese during the Second World War. And those specific atrocities are in relationship to the rape of Nanking. It is a video that looks very hard at the possibility of reconciliation. And again, I thought that perhaps inaugurating this talk with the notion of reconciliation on a subject that is so immensely fraught by conflict was perhaps an idea. And I mean the possibility, right? Because it is a possibility, it's not in reality a certainty. And then finally, the reason why I wanted to show you this is because I have a lot of stuff, and I was really afraid that I would not be able to get to this. And it is at the end of the lecture, and hopefully we will be able to see the full 10 minutes, but if not, at least you've gotten a little bit of an introduction to it. Okay, so let's give me a second so that I can get us in sync. Okay, so there we go, right? Okay, so the topic is feminism and identity politics in the visual arts during those 4 decades. It is an impossible subject. I'll do the best that I can to sort of give you a very broad idea of it. The players are so numerous, the ideas are so complex that to sort of attempt to do that within the scope of an hour would be impossible. So bear with me. I'm going to sort of draw very broad brushstrokes, hopefully giving you an overall view of these issues. I would like to sort of start by saying that we live in a period that perhaps we would all agree is referred to as postmodernism, and postmodernism is very much sort of related to what we speak of also as post-structuralism. And these are big words, but essentially what they mean is that there was at a certain point towards the end of the 20th century a huge shift of paradigm, a way of thinking about the world, who we are in the world, what we can do in the world, right? And ultimately about the role of language in making us who we are. As part of that shift, there was an emergent science, if you will, at the beginning of the 20th century that had a huge impact into the philosophers, the continental philosophers that constitute this sort of umbrella of post-structuralism. This science is the science of semiotics, or the science of language, if you will, right? So I'm going to start with that because semiotics is sort of important. I'm not going to lecture on semiotics, so don't panic, right? I'm not by any means an expert on semiotics, but it is sort of important to sort of say that one of the contributions of semiotics is sort of letting us sort of understand that meaning comes about not by equivalence, but by difference. In other words, the color blue is blue not because it is blue, it's because it is not red or yellow or green, etc. Right? So, in other words, we acquire meaning through the opposition of terms, through difference. Right? Sort of an important thing to sort of consider right away. And then secondly, perhaps right away, one of the amazing things that comes about from the advent of semiotic thinking is that the relationship between the word and what the word signifies is also arbitrary. It's not natural. Okay, so if we say woman, for example, right, we're not speaking about nature. We're speaking about language. We're speaking about a construction of language that is determined by a historical set of circumstances, right? I'm going to ask you at least to consider that, right? So, to begin with then, perhaps, right, in order for us to understand what importance there therefore lies in feminism and feminist theory, we need to understand to a certain degree patriarchy. Without that, obviously, the whole category loses significance, right? So I thought that perhaps this was a great image to start. It's an image by Linda Nochlin, and it is from the 70s. And in a certain way, she's sort of playing with words here and with images, right? On the left, basically, is a French caption from an advertisement, and it says, "Will you buy my apples?" Right? On the right, it's Linda Nochlin sort of take and says, "Would you buy my bananas?" Right? Pretty straightforward, right? But what she's also sort of in some way telling us is that apples are not the word apple doesn't necessarily signify apple here, right? It signifies something else, right? Or banana, for that matter, here, right, does not necessarily signify what we generally think of banana, right? This is what I'm basically saying, that there's an arbitrary relationship, right, between the word and what it signifies. And it can shift, and that's really exciting, really, really exciting. Okay, so in order for us to understand identity, we need to understand a little bit of the trajectory of what is it that constitutes the self, right? How is it that we think of ourselves? How is it that that comes into being? And as everything else that's related to the human condition, it is contextual, it is historically determined, right? So we have two models, two hugely important models that have determined our understanding of who we are. One of them is the model that we generally describe to as the model of consciousness, right? The other one is a model of subjectivity. And they are, again, historically determined, right? And they sort of are associated with very specific sort of producers. On my left here, the philosopher of the Enlightenment, René Descartes, right? This is a person who sort of inaugurates this discourse of consciousness, if you will, within the context of philosophy in the West. On the other hand, we have Sigmund Freud, who sort of like changes all of that in a really interesting way, right? By introducing the term subjectivity as defining identity and the self. Okay, so we have two paradigms, consciousness and subjectivity. Let's look first at the paradigm of consciousness. It comes about from the thought, the work, the explorations, the philosophical, if you will, engagement of René Descartes. And it is a model that arises from a profound belief in a religious experience. René Descartes was a devoted Roman Catholic. Behind all his operations was the desire to prove to himself that certain entities were universal, that they were authentic, that they were timeless. Ultimately, if you sort of like get my drift, what he was talking about always, in one way or another, was the notion of God residing in something that was not contextual, conditional, right? Or bound to a specific sort of set of circumstances. He does this through very complicated operations. I'm not going to go into that, right? But as you all know, one of the things that defines, and this is where I want to go really quickly, that defines what we understand in relation to Cartesian thought, is that through a series of reductions, and this is important, reductions, exclusions, right? Descartes sort of closes his mind to everything that might be deceiving, that might be an illusion, that might be tied to something temporal, right? And in this series of reductions, then he finds himself at a core point of knowledge, according to him, right? Where he sort of makes this pronouncement that probably all of you have heard at some point or another: I think, therefore I am. Right? Okay. It's extremely important for us to understand that this paradigm of thinking about the self reigns without contestation in the West for about 250 to 300 years. It's immensely influential. It's actually probably the way that you think about yourself. Probably, right? Maybe not all of you, but at least some of you are very tied into this notion of identity, right? First of all, that who we are resides inside of us. Sorry about that. I just banged on the microphone. Okay, that resides inside of us, that it is a dimension of interiority. That who we are, in other words, comes from the inside out, right? And that it is timeless, in other words, we were born with it, right? Constitutes a type of destiny, if you will. That it is original and that it is authentic. There's nobody like you. This is what this sort of paradigm of Descartes sort of suggests to us. Obviously, it also sort of like assumes that it is possible to know who you are, right? And in that sense, then, it produces a fixed, what I would call a fixed notion of identity, right? If you got the lottery right, you somehow are blessed by coming into being with an identity, if you will, that you'll have to sort of like honor the rest of your life, right? And if you're not, you are sort of cursed, right? But there's very little shifting there. As a matter of fact, we could say that the Cartesian paradigm is something that actually gives voice to a form of belief or knowledge, we could say, right, that articulates human thinking since the beginning of time. It's, after all, sort of like the image, sort of like the trajectory of what we find in like the classical three-act structure, for example, in Hollywood movies, right? The journey of the hero, right? The individual sort of starts in life, generally as a naive, right? And then through a series of immense tribulations, disadvantages, obstacles, right, sort of comes into a relationship of knowledge with who she or he really is ultimately, right? So in the words of the philosopher, the feminist philosopher, an extraordinary sort of writer, theoretician Kaja Silverman, in that beautiful little book, like a beautiful little book titled The Subject of Semiotics, which has to do with semiotics, but about a lot more as well. We have it in the library, check it out. In that book, basically what she refers to, or how she describes this then is that what the Cartesian paradigm sort of proposes to us is that our life quest is to engage with a series of exfoliations. That's how she calls it, exfoliations, peelings of layers of self, so that you can arrive at that kernel, if you will, of truth, right? That's immutable, that's timeless, original, authentic, etc. Okay, hopefully I made my point sort of more or less clear, right? This is essentially what Descartes proposes to us. And like I said, probably when you're sort of listening to me, you're saying, yeah, right? That somehow makes a lot of sense, right? Be careful. This is a trap. This is a very complicated situation, right? Okay, so because think about it for a little bit, right? In terms of what I mentioned earlier, right? If you're at the core, if you will, of power and influence, this is a blessing, right? If on the other hand you're at the margin, right? Like, for example, being a woman, right? This is a curse. There's nothing that you can do other than live the destiny of a woman in the, 17th century. Not a pretty picture, right? Okay, so we don't think about this way perhaps so much today, but another implication of the Cartesian sort of mindset is a split. There's a split between the mind and the body. Right? In this progression, one of the things that's most deceiving for Descartes is the body, right? The body and its sensory apparatus. It can be deceived, right? Many different ways, right? You sort of like brew a little bit of something here, you take it on, everything changes, right? You go eat a mushroom somewhere else, and it's even worse, right? You get angry, everything changes, right? So the body and its sensations, it's continuously sort of in a state of flux. The mind, however, in this sort of reduction that he engages with, appears to Descartes to be equivalent with the spirit, and with the spirit that reflects the presence of God. So he sort of establishes a hierarchy of values where, as you might imagine, right, the mind is the higher ground, right? The body is the lower entity. Is that clear somehow, right? Okay, from the very beginning then, what we're going to say is that probably you have heard certain sort of gender associations with the mind and the body. Have you? Right? In a certain sort of like particular paradigm that, we question and that we challenge continuously now, right? Certain gender associations come with this, and I'm not going to let it out of the bag, but you can sort of always begin to think of this, right? Higher, lower, gender associations, right? Mind, body, etc. The initial configuration of feminist art in the 1970s, in a very peculiar way, associated itself very much with this model, right? And that is, highly problematic, and we're going to get there, hopefully, if I move quickly. Okay, second paradigm. So all of this sort of like makes great sense. It's immensely influential. It's fairly uncontested until this individual comes along, right? And what sort of like he proposes to us is something totally different and sort of unanticipated, right? What he basically sort of proposes to us is this, is that actually we don't know much at all of who we are. That we know a little bit of it, right? But that below that sort of knowledgeable self, right, or the conscious, lies an oceanic, almost monstrous territory of the unconscious. And that actually it's in the unconscious where basically our drives, our desires, right, our actual actions in the world sort of emerge from. He also sort of tells us that those desires, that those drives that actually in a very mysterious way will articulate who we are sort of determined by the body, an experience of the body very early on in life. And not just the body in general, but actually the body in terms of genitals, right? And what he calls the erotogenic zones. And what he also suggests to us is that those also are sort of assigned, that they are not natural, which is sort of like bewildering for us to think of, right? But he actually sort of suggests, and I'm not going to go into this too much, that it's essentially the care that the mother gives to certain parts of the body that constitutes those parts of the body as erotogenic zones. It's really interesting, right? So what he's saying is something very different from Descartes. He's actually telling us that actually it's a realm of exteriority It's our experience, our encounter with the world, the mother, the family, if you will, right, that constitutes at a very early stage a structure for the self. And he's also saying that the self is really ultimately unknowable. Very different thing, right? However, I would like to think that Freud is very much still working with a fixed notion of identity, right? Because if indeed you are configured through the body, if the body is, and its sort of like sensory, sensual apparatus, is a defining mechanism by which we come into being, right? Then there's very little else that we can do for the rest of our lives, right? We're sort of left with our neuroses, our psychosis, you know, our pathologies, etc., configuring us as subjectivities. Okay, so the good news, right, is that Freud was onto something, and he had a whole bunch of followers, and amongst those followers was this pretty extraordinary sort of like individual, another psychoanalyst by the name of Jacques Lacan. Lacan had come into contact with semiotics very early on, and was able to sort of bridge psychoanalytic theory as Freud sort of saw it, as something that was sort of configured through an experience of the body, onto a series of symbolically structured relationships with the world. In other words, what Lacan does for us is he says it is not in the body, it is in language. We are not determined as beings through our experience of the body. It is how is it that we encounter symbolic structures in the world that we become who we are. Okay? This is sort of a little bit complicated, and, you know, like I said, I want to sort of do something that's fairly general, but if indeed that is the case, right, then it is, the self is contextual. Language is always changing. The conditions of representation are determined by history and the conditions of that historical period, be those social, economic, political, etc., right? It is also important, inevitably, that will happen. Okay. The most extraordinary thing here, and this might not be so evident now, right, but hopefully will become as we're talking about this topic in a few minutes, is that if indeed the subject is constructed through representations, through symbols, right, then it can be broken down through representations, through language, and to symbol operations. That is huge. You have no idea what this meant for the feminist movement, for the gay lesbian movement, for people of color, etc., for all sorts of minorities that saw themselves relegated to a natural sort of like relationship with identity that was immutable. The possibility of thinking of identity as something fluid and something that could be transformed by an understanding, if you will, of the variables, those representational variables that constituted identity, this was immensely transformative. So, what I'm basically saying here is that Jacques Lacan is at the core of feminist thinking, right? If not on the second wave, certainly on the third wave, right? But definitely present from the very beginning as a reference. What we could also say then is that we could contextualize perhaps the formation of the subject in relationship to modernity, right? Modernity is that huge period, right, spanning from about the Renaissance onto the 1900s, and we could assign that perhaps to Descartes, right? Modernism, we could also say, perhaps in very general terms, that it's that period that spans between the 1900s and the late sort of like 1900s, 1960s, you know, 70s at the most, and that's sort of defined by a conception of identities that we can locate on Freud. And then perhaps postmodernism and post-structuralism sort of fueled, not exclusively, but most certainly by Lacanian thinking in regards to identity. Okay, what we could also say, let's see, is the following, is that our, oops, I'm losing track here. Hold on just a minute. Okay, great. So we are arriving in one way or another to the decades, right, in which feminism sort of emerged. And feminism, you know, emerged more or less in the 1960s, definitely came into being with full force in the 1970s, right? In order for us to sort of like get there, however, we need to sort of figure out a little bit of what was there before, right, in the visual arts. And what was there before is what we call high modernism. And it's represented by the thought of this particularly by the thought of this critic, the name of Clement Greenberg. It stresses certain sort of essentialist notions, specific notions, like medium specificity, an isolation of the disciplines. He actually sees, like what we see now, interdisciplinarity, which we think is like a great thing, for him was a corruption of the disciplines, a contamination of the disciplines, right? The more discrete and separate the disciplines, the more profound and powerful, if you will, their operations. He's also very much in opposition to any sort of consideration of a political dimension for art, which is sort of startling for some of us at this point in time, right? Because from our perspective, perhaps, and hopefully something that's not going to be too shocking, right? There is no such thing as art that's not political. All art is political, right? All art in one way or another has a political import, even if it sort of doesn't want to pose itself as political. I've sort of like said this to some of my friends. I love an aphorism from my friend David Deacher. He says, it's always political even if you are not up to it, right? Right? So in contrast to this, however, Greenberg sort of denies a political dimension to art. I think at some point he refers to it as an impediment of the mind, the political dimension. And he also abhors representation. In other words, the work needs to be abstract, needs to be separate from the world. It cannot refer to the world or the body specifically. It has to exist in sort of this idealized space of, again, of the mind and the spirit. Going back to that Cartesian, if you will, sort of modeling, right? The body, representation, the world, if you will, nature, all of that is sort of exists in a lower realm. And as such, it cannot enter into the realm of representation. I can tell you for one thing, when I went to school, at a certain point, I'm not going to date myself too much, but in the late 20th century, you could not actually paint anything that looked like anything. Your professors would immediately fail you. You were seen as a hack. You painted a nude? Give me a break. That's not art. You painted landscape. It was horrifying, right? So there was this sort of like very specific moment in high modernism where art really, really separates itself from the world in a very Cartesian sense, right? And obeying perhaps the same ideas, right, that sort of articulate Cartesian thinking. Okay, so what are we talking about? We're talking about these guys, okay? And one woman. I love this story because it's a really hilarious sort of story. In a certain way, tragic in others, right? The abstract expressionist movement was a reigning paradigm in the 1950s, there was very little alternative to this. The players that you see here are sort of fairly important. At the core is the painter Jackson Pollock, who's sort of like the god, if you will, of this club. And here we have Mark Rothko. Here we have Robert Motherwell, Clifford Still, Wilhelm de Kooning, who just had a huge, huge retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art, right? You saw it. Good for you. Lucky you. Lucky you. Okay, and many other players. And then here we have Etta Stern. Actually, Etta Stern was an artist, but came into this picture by accident. The photographer thought that they needed something else in the picture, right? So he said to her, you know, would you do us a favor? Can you stand on that table in the back? Like an ornament, right? Can you stand on that table in the back? She does not belong to this group. It is, you know, one of the sort of instances where objectification really is absolutely monstrous, right? She sort of like actually had to live with this for the rest of her life and resented very much the fact that actually she had consented to being part of this. But at any rate, what I'm trying to say is that high modernism is a boys' club. I mean, it's not just a boys' club, it's a white boys' club, right? And there's very little, if any, sort of like opening to anything else. Women, people of color, people of different nationalities, etc., right? It is very much a heterosexual, European, white male sort of like reduct of power, right? I'm not exaggerating this, by the way. This is essentially the construct of late modernism. It also is constructed on this sort of, heroic dimension, if you will, of the male artist, right? And so much exemplified by the Hans Nemeth photographs of Jackson Pollock. And let's see what Jackson Pollock is doing. What is Jackson Pollock doing? Yeah.
Making lines, like squiggles with paint.
He's throwing paint, right? He's throwing paint with a stick, right? He's splattering, exactly. But in reality, what he's doing is sort of like saying, I don't give a damn about history. I don't give a damn about culture. I am sort of gifted. I am gifted by my identity, something that's irreducible, my own, right? That does not have in any way to respond to society, to culture, to history. I'm sort of redoing it all over again, right? And if you get it, great. If you don't get it, I don't care, right? That's essentially the paradigm of late modernism. This has been obviously mythologized to the point that, as we all are, right? I mean, art is not a natural experience, right? You might, this sort of mythology that somehow we stand in front of a work of art and the work of art sort of speaks to us in an unmediated manner. That's nonsense. We always experience a work of art in relationship to what we know about that art type of production. Or that art period, or those producers, if you will, right? So if you have been educated into abstraction, you go to the Museum of Modern Art, and you look at this, and you go, wow, right? If you haven't been educated into it, as a lot of people do, even going to the Museum of Modern Art, they go up to it, and they say, what is that? My kid could do that, right? Okay, so basically what I'm saying is that there's nothing intrinsically valuable, right, in any sense of the word, about a work of art. It is something that you are educated into, okay? Now, so what we're educated into with abstract expressionism is essentially the cult of the male hero, right? And other examples of this would be William de Kooning and the very tragic, unfortunate, and personality of Mark Rothko. All these works, essentially, right, exist outside of the social, exist outside of the contingencies of the moment. They do not want to concern themselves with social, political, economic sort of, realities. As a matter of fact, like I say, they think that those are sort of impediments of the creative personality. So the cult of genius, right, an individuality, if you will, that is so much part of the male archetype in the West, is at a peak, if you will, at this point in history. Okay, so that is the backdrop, okay? Feminist timelines. We have proto-feminism, which we speak of generally as proto-feminism, and that's essentially what happens, before the 1800s. It's not that there were no feminist sort of like personalities before that period, but rather the efforts were not organized in any cohesive way that could affect change. There's certainly sort of big heroes, like from the period preceding the 1800s, but not in the sense, like I say, of a coalition of forces and ideology that could affect change. The first time that feminist sort of ideology comes into that sort of position of power is as it organizes itself around the right of voting, or suffrage, right? And suffrage is a very specific, however, moment. It's also referred to as the first wave, and it happens generally between the 1800s and the 1900s. It's an immensely important period. It's a very immensely important part of the movement, but it is exclusively, I would say, yeah, exclusively organized around the notion of the right to vote. It is really conflicted too. It is really conflicted as well, because it is very much determined by class and by race. It is primarily a movement of white upper-class women. And there's many instances that, actually qualify that. A notable instance, for example, was the Washington Parade in 1913, when activist Alice Paul did not allow black feminist Ida Wells Barnett to march with the other white women. Instead, Paul told her that she could march at the back of the procession with the other black women. Right? So things are not tidy. Right? It's very important that we think of things as not tidy, because they're never tight. They're always sort of somehow complex and immensely problematized, if you will, right, by the human dimension and the subjectivities that exert themselves on such a situation. The second wave of feminism is what we are interested in sort of exploring today, and definitely, hopefully, the third wave. Second wave is the larger eruption, if you will, right, that we also associate with the women's liberation movement of the 1960s and 70s. It is huge. It is immensely influential. It is immensely controversial as well, right? And it concerns itself not only now with sort of like the specificity, if you will, of that political voting, political participation dimension, but with all aspects of the human experience, particularly the women's human experience: sexuality, reproductive rights, the position in the workplace, discrimination, etc. It's a huge horizon that opens up. It is plagued, however, by a set of confusing premises that are Cartesian, like I said, emerging from that notion of Descartes and authenticity, right? And by a mixture with Freudian notions about the body and the importance of the body as a site of knowledge, right? So for the second wave feminists, the body is sort of like almost everything, right? And sexuality is as well an immensely defining variable. And we're going to see some examples of that in just a minute. Third wave feminism, on the other hand, right, comes in contact with continental philosophy and with post-structuralism, with the thought of Julia Kristeva and Jacques Lacan, and understands that it is a lot more complicated than that, and it is related to symbolic exchanges rather than a location in the body. And as such, then, it critiques very harshly, the second wave movement, right? And it refers to the second wave movement as a moment of essentialism, right? And we're going to sort of try to talk about what that means in just a minute. Okay. Oh, God. Okay. Two major periods for feminism and identity. We speak of identity politics as a period between 1970 and 1980s generally, and post-identity politics from the 1980s on to the present. Quick framing of the 1960s, because it's sort of important, right? It's an immensely conflicted period. It's a period of great upheaval all over the world. It's not just something that happens in America, right, or in Europe. It happens all over the place, and it's characterized by great degrees of conflict, of which generational wars were not a small part, and I think that a category that needs to be revised and addressed at some point in more detail than it has so far. Women are increasingly moving into the workplace, which is immensely important, right? Political autonomy comes tied to economic autonomy, right? And it is until literally the period that follows the Second World War where women really begin to enter into the workforce in significant numbers and begin to achieve significant forms of economic autonomy, to begin to determine and think for this sort of categories that I'm sort of proposing to you. Political independence, economic independence, sexual independence, independence in terms of procreative rights, etc. I was going to play this, but I think I'm just, for the sake of time, I'm going to move forward and go straight on to this notion. Okay, the Woman House. This is the piece that inaugurates the history of feminism in the arts. And it is a piece that is fairly complex. Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro understood very clearly, if intuitively perhaps, or rationally, although unlikely because Lacan had not been translated yet, but at least intuitively, the fact that the symbolic realm that Lacan refers to, which is the symbolic realm of patriarchy, permeates absolutely everything in our experience, absolutely everything. Your shoe, the roof, the chair, the car, advertisement, desire, etc. Right? And that as such then, it was also present within academia. And so, Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro decided that in order for them to develop a women's program, right, that addressed specifically feminist concerns, they could not work within the structure of CalArts, which is where they taught. So they secured this house in Hollywood, and they sort of like transformed it into this workshop for women, exclusively for women, to develop feminist ideas, feminist theory, and most importantly, feminist artworks. Like everything else, right, as I mentioned earlier, that is contaminated by patriarchal symbolic exchanges, art is polluted, more perhaps than anything else, by those power relationships, right? So from the very beginning, women in this second wave began to explore forms of art that were not colonized, if you will, right, by male sensibilities quite yet. One of them is performance art. Performance art is still something that a lot of people don't quite understand. It's not music, it's not sort of theater, it is a form in itself. And it is highly confrontational, it seeks to involve the audience, it is not performed with a script, it actually happens in real time, right, etc. One of the earliest pieces is Faith Wilding's Waiting. And in this piece, she sits and sort of, without much body movement, in a monotone, low voice, speaks about waiting. And what she says, waiting for my breasts to develop, waiting to get married, waiting to hold my baby, waiting for the first gray hair, waiting for my body to break down, to get ugly, waiting for my breasts to shrivel up, waiting for a visit from my children, for letters, waiting to get sick, waiting to sleep, etc. Right? So what she's essentially doing, obviously, is pointing out a certain degree of impotence, right, and passivity inherent into a model of the feminine, right, that is still very much present at that point in time. Cock and Kent, Faith Wilding and Janet Lester. This is another sort of performance from the Woman House, right? This is a parodic comedy in which the cock and the cunt, if you will, right, sort of struggle. And in this struggle, there is a self-castration sort of effect in which the cock sort of rips off his penis and beats to death the cunt for demanding sexual pleasure. There is you know, a really interesting sort of like passage here, and it is it goes along more or less the same. In this schematic dialogue between husband, played by Faith Wilding, and wife, Janice Lester, the deadly portrayal of the battle between the sexes demonstrates a culturally assumed connection between biological differences and sex roles. The Cock and the Cunt play addresses the traditional relationship between white, middle-class men and women in their physical particulars, and also in broad social terms, an aspect of the balance of power within the political patriarchal institution. There is then, we can sort of begin to see, right, as we will see, for example, in the menstruation room of Judy Chicago as well, an emphasis on body, and specifically on the particulars of the woman's body. One of the most striking, perhaps, performances of that time is Carolee Schneemann's Interior Scroll from 1975. In which she extracts from her vagina this scroll that then she proceeds on to read. And it's a scroll obviously addressing the shortcomings, if you will, of patriarchy and the place of women within the art world structures. So we have a location then of identity in this first iteration of feminist art, second wave feminist movement, that is based on a relationship with the body, genitalia, body fluids, if you will, also very specific to the women's body. And then there's also this other iteration, which is really fascinating, which seeks to sort of validate forms of creativity that are sort of diminished or dismissed by patriarchy, if you will, at that point. And this comes in the pattern and decoration movement, right? An extremely important movement, more or less championed by Miriam Shapiro. And here what we have are artworks that use materials like cloth and fiber, right? Embroidery, things of this sort that traditionally have not, to that point, been considered sort of like serious art, right? So there is this desire to validate the experience of women in craft, right? And bring it to the level, if you will, of fine arts. Also the imagery, as you can, I don't know if you can see, are these sort of beautifully constructed dolls that are made in the house generally, and so on and so forth. One of the most important pieces of this period is the The Dinner Party by Judy Chicago. It's a monumental piece. It's a piece that now is enshrined, and everybody sort of, again, educated into the sort of response, right? But at that particular point is a piece that divided and produced immense polemics. The dinner Party is a tribute. It's a tribute to 1,038 women in history. 38 women are represented by place settings, and another 999 names are inscribed in the heritage floor on which the table rests. Each place is configured by a plate, a ceramic plate that Judy Chicago and her collaborators have produced. And as you will see, they bring us back to this notion of identity through the body. All of them, like in this case, it's Virginia Woolf, right? It's labia, vaginal sort of imagery, Emily Dickinson, St. Hildegard of Bingen. Does anybody know who that is? Amazing woman. 11th century feminist, if you can imagine that, right? And somebody who basically had an extraordinary career, or a career, we should say that trajectory, as a writer, composer, philosopher, Christian mystic, Benedictine abbess, visionary, and polymath. So, in other words, what Judy Chicago is doing is sort of bringing from history this immensely important icons of feminine power, right? And celebrating them in this extraordinary display. The display now is at the Brooklyn Museum, at the Sackler Center for Feminist Art, and that's sort of like the installation view. Another sort of major player of this second wave is Ana Mendieta. Ana Mendieta, again, is sort of insisting in this notion of identity, of human female identity through a form of communion, if you will, with nature and with the body, right? An identification with that. Her performances on the landscape are sort of legendary now. She died, unfortunately, at a very early age under very tragic circumstances. But they are all very much essentially seeking to equate feminine identity, or women's identity, with a privileged relationship with the natural, right, or with nature. Their most famous pieces of Ana Mendieta are the silhouette of figures in which she actually produces imprints on the landscape with her own body. Somebody wants to look up the way that she died. It's a really pretty striking sort of relationship with one and the other. Okay, so very quickly here, I would love to be able to show you this piece of, at least a little bit of this piece by Martha Rossler. Martha Rossler begins to break with that, begins to separate herself from the notion of body and nature, and begins to engage with the notion of language and the intricacies of language, and how could those things perhaps be disrupted. How is it that you could begin to unpack, right, what was inherent in language? So let's see if this actually works. The audio and the video are out of sync. We couldn't get through that today, but hopefully it'll be okay.
Apron. Bowl. Chopper. Dish. Egg beater. Fork. Grater. hamburger press. Ice pick.
Okay, so you get the idea, right? Right? So we talked about, right, when this sort of notion, signifier, signified, right? They are sort of arbitrarily coupled. They don't necessarily have to obey that coupling, right? What we think of domesticity and what we think of femininity here is sort of completely sort of disrupted, right? By sort of like actually exposing, right, the outright, rage, danger, anger somehow, implicit in performing, if you will, those idealized roles of womanhood. Another artist of this time that also begins to move away from that notion again of the body and nature and moving into sort of like rather the relationships that are structured through language and through representations, and in her particular case through the representations of race. I love this. This is a card that she hands to people. And she handed to people, during those years. I don't know if she does it still, but essentially this is what it says. It's like a little visitation card, right? It says, "Dear friend, I am black. I am sure you did not realize this when you made, laughed, or had agreed at that racist remark. In the past, I have attempted to alert white people to my racial identity in advance. Unfortunately, this invariably causes them to react to me as pushy, manipulative, or socially inappropriate. Therefore, my policy is to assume that white people do not make these remarks, even when they believe there are no black people present, and to distribute this card when they do. I regret any discomfort my presence is causing you, just as I am sure you regret the discomfort your racism is causing me." This one is even better, right? So she moves away from race now into sort of like gender, and sexual dynamics. It's to be distributed at a party, obviously, some sort of gathering. "Dear friend, I am not here to pick anyone up or to be picked up. I am here alone because I want to be here alone. This card is not intended as part of an extended flirtation. Thank you for respecting my privacy." Okay, so we are sort of talking about something quite different as it begins to profile itself here, right? And, I wish that I could show you a video of hers. It's titled Corner. It's a very confrontational, very harsh video, very difficult video, but it's also long and we don't have the time. So I'm going to move forward on to Barbara Kruger. Barbara Kruger now really is very clearly sort of dealing with us in terms of language, right? And the power dynamics that somehow are distributed in culture, not only along the lines of gender and race, but in every type of difference, right? This is a fantastic piece, as all of them are. Who is free to choose, who is beyond the law, who is healed, who is housed, who speaks, who is silenced, who salutes the longest, who prays loudest, who dies first, who laughs last. Right? Marvelous, right? As an examination, if you will, of privilege. Constitution of identity in consumerism, right? In other words, sort of what we're seeing now is sort of a feminist sort of sensibility that's moving beyond the essentialist notion, right? That the body and nature define femininity and actually seeks to sort of like interpose itself, right, between the audience and official language and disrupt that set of exchanges, right? Another one, these are really marvelous. And then another one. She does this marvelous thing of sort of like making evident what somehow, goes unnoticed. I mean, everybody loves Norman Rockwell, right? But do we sort of like, and why do we love Norman Rockwell, right? It's because we've been educated into loving Norman Rockwell, and generally not in a critical, examined way. If we look at basically what Norman Rockwell paintings represent, they are outright perhaps dangerous, right? They are sort of like always upholding a certain sort of idea of the family that is always heterosexual, it's always white, and it's always relatively affluent. The rest of us, right, sort of like are in another sort of territory. Okay, another sort of really interesting artist is sort of Sherry Levine, and this is really something that just drove the art world crazy. Okay, and it did so because what she did is sort of she went to masterpieces of male genius, if you will, geniuses, right, such as Walker Evans. And what she did is literally she photographed the images from the catalog and attributed them to herself. What do you think of that? Okay, as simple as that might seem, it's actually an extraordinarily astute strategy, because what she's doing here is really, very clever. What she's doing is certainly doing a copy, a form of plagiarism on something that's evident, right? She's not looking for something obscure. It's evident that she's doing it. So what she's sort of telling us is that there's a lot more to the way that we experience art than the image itself. Right? That embedded in our sort of like understanding of what art is are a series of exchanges that have to do with authorship and originality, right? That she wants us to think about, right? So it is not the image, it's not the object, it's essentially the context, the conceptual context or umbrella in which that sort of piece actually exists. Other instances of that would be a take of Duchamp's Urinal, right? Some of you know that, or The Fountain, actually. That's the right name. Rodeshenko, another sort of take on her work. Even more controversial, the work of this extraordinary artist, Kara Walker. Kara Walker is immensely gifted and proposes to us that race relationships, gender relationships, sexual relationships are immensely complicated. She's immensely controversial, for lack of a better word, because she does not correspond to the expectation that we have, again, the naturalized expectation of what an African American woman should do or should use as her forms of representations. They all look extremely sort of benign, but once you begin to look at the details, right, of this beautiful, by the way, they're paper cuts. They're black paper cuts on walls. You begin to see that they are immensely more complicated, and that the division, if you will, between the races and the sexes are sort of problematized in not clean, neat ways, right? In other words, she's not honoring an expectation, perhaps, right, that we have from what a woman of such, race or such age or such location would sort of produce for us. Very much the same way with Lorna Simpson. Lorna Simpson sort of also wants us to sort of examine how is it that we see and how is it that we have intersection of what we see with certain language assignations. But she does not want to close for us the way that we're reading, if you will, these images. A couple of examples here, and for the reason of time, I'm just going to have to move a little bit quicker. I think I'm going to finish with Nikki S. Lee. Nikki S. Lee is perhaps one of the most, a very young artist, by the way, of Korean American background, and she sort of like is in my mind one of the most astute third wave feminist artists, in the sense that she really demonstrates for us in her pictures, right, in her images, how contextual and conditional the notion of identity is. So in every sort of like sense of the word, she transforms herself from one picture to another, right, depending on context. Here she is sort of embodying a Latino. Here she represents to us as a hip hopper. Here she assumes the character of a woman in a lesbian bar. And there's many other instances. I think I missed one here at the front. Okay, so she's disguised as an elderly person, right? So what she basically wants to insist on is that somehow identity is not fixed, it's not natural, it is somehow conditional, it's culturally determined. You frame it in a certain way and it shifts, right? This is extraordinary. This is like marvelous. This is really, inspiring. Right? In other words, what I've sort of tried to say today in my roundabout way is that there's a paradigm of the self that's somehow still alive and perhaps within you. And it's a paradigm that holds you in place at a disadvantage in relationship to dominant culture. No matter who you are, there's always an aspect of the self that's other, that does not fit, that's not normal. Right? And that if you somehow believe that that is fixed because you were born with it, because it was a God-given, if you will, sort of entity, it's a pretty sad situation to be in. There are different ways of thinking that feminist art and feminist thinking have facilitated that allow us to think of the self as something that is contextual and always in a state of transformation. A big part of that is education, right? If you work with language and education, you transform yourself, the very core of yourself. So I would like to sort of like perhaps insist on this notion that who we are is a lot less of what comes from the inside out, a lot more of what we expose ourselves into relationship to the outside world. Okay, that's pretty much what I have to say. I should say my apologies if I sort of seem rushed. There was a lot to sort of talk about. I think that we did most of what I intended to do. But it would be important perhaps to answer questions if there's questions from the audience. Yes?
How about your own art? Where would you place your own art?
I am very, well, my own art is, thank you, and I'll try not to sort of be too self-absorbed, although I'm an artist and that comes with a territory. But what I would say is I'm very interested in obviously the notion of otherness. But at the same time, I don't do a single type of art. I do a number of things. In my curatorial work, which I consider my artwork, I generally engage very strongly with issues of this sort. With issues of difference and political activism. In my video work, I move between forms of political commentary to pieces that are more contemplative, if you will. In painting, I've done significant bodies of work of political painting. Perhaps the largest body of work is of political painting. I haven't done a lot of painting in the recent past. Thanks for asking. Yes.
You were talking about Jackson Pollock, that it's art, but it's something that you have to get. About that whole bit, would you say that was a true paradox?
Well, it is a complicated thing. One of the things that I love is like something that a long time ago sort of like suggested to me, and this might be shocking for people, right? But suppose the question, if somebody does an extraordinary painting, right? And it's basically in an attic. And the only person that sees it is the artist. Is it art or is it not art? I think that from our historical perspective at this moment, we would say it's not. In order for art to be art, it needs to enter into a conversation with the culture, right? So what I'm basically saying is that the problem with abstract expressionism, right, as we see it from now, is the way that it shunned the social, right, and isolated itself in a rarefied form of subjectivity that was self-referential, self-absorbed, and ultimately sort of like the pinnacle of that patriarchal model, right, that we see spanning all those centuries in Western history, particularly, obviously, exacerbated in the 20th century. Yes?
I think I want to tag on to that. So can you talk a little bit about access to art in terms of, you talked about you having to be taught to understand some of the modernist art, and even this art has a historical context that.
Of course.
If we don't have that context, it's harder to access that art.
It's absolutely, right? So what hopefully comes about in the lecture is that art does not exist outside of the social. It's an integral part of the social and can only be understood within that social. So that's the other biggie that somehow upsets a lot of people, right? The notion that art is universal and timeless is, again, a very hard thing to believe or to sort of, come to terms with. Because these are beautiful words, right? I mean, particularly the notion of the universal, right? It's such a wonderful word, right? But in reality, it's such a horrifying word, right? If you are outside of the universal, because that so happens, right? There's no such thing as being universal, as a universal entity. There's always difference, right? And if you're outside of that difference, then it's sort of scary. The feminist filmmaker, Tri Minh Ha, an immensely influential Vietnamese filmmaker, says within any universalizing effort, there's massive amounts of repression. Right? Think of colonialism. Right? The belief, from the West, that somehow the values of the West were indeed universal, and that it was the duty, right, of the West to sort of actually educate or inculcate those values, right, into other people. Terrifying, right? I mean, and when we're talking about there, it's not ideas. We're talking about bodies and sensations, right? Does that more or less go there? Yeah. Yes.
How would you say that the ideas of the womanist movement and womanist philosophy
Well, obviously, all of this comes from a realm of ideas, and this is what I would like to sort of like emphasize. The notion of Jackson Pollock somehow generating culture by splattering paint is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about art that is informed by the historical conditions that determine its production, right? So there is a moment in history that we try to, or moments in history that we try to look at today, right, that produce certain types of work out of the ideas, the conditions, the difficulties, if you will, right, the privileges encountered by artists at a certain particular time, right? So in the 1970s, definitely there is enough momentum, right? There is enough anger, there is enough resources, and there is enough conceptual capital for the feminist movement sort of within the arts to sort of coalesce into this magnificent force, right? That still, by the way, today is extremely active and extremely important. By the way, there's a collection of books back there that are really amazing. I thank you, Kathy, if you're here. I don't know if Kathy Veras is here. One such instance is and I didn't get to talk about collectives, by the way, right? One of the most interesting things about women's art is that from the very beginning, the notion of collectivity was sort of very dominant. As you know, the lone genius male artist in the solitude of his tower, right? Is sort of like a paradigm of modernism that's somehow very dear to the modernist mind. But in the postmodern sense, the more intersections between people and ideas, right, the more powerful the art. And this is something that women understood, I think, from the very beginning of the feminist movement. So today, there's huge amounts of collaborative, if you will, women groups, where it's not the group of one person, but there's the group of it's a work of the group, where the labor is distributed in terms of research, production, distribution, etc. Yes?
Would you say at this point there's any type of art that is no longer male-dominant but kind of equal?
Well, yes, I would say so, with a great degree of caution, because I think, well, let me explain it this way, okay? What Lacan proposes to us is that patriarchy in its symbolic realm is so pervasive that, and by definition it is symbolic, right, that it's no longer identified, like Freudian thought was, with the man's body or the woman's body. It is everywhere. In other words, from the perspective of the symbolic realm of the father, which is essentially what Lacan speaks of, all of us, men and women and everybody else, is equally complicit in upholding, if you will, right, in one way or another, that symbolic realm of the father. Another way of saying this is from Michel Foucault, the postmodern philosopher. He says, in many instances, beware of the fascist within, right? What he also sort of tells us, and at the same time, right, is that we have to be very careful with the notion of responsibility. And when he speaks of responsibility, he generally directs it at Jean-Paul Sartre and existentialism. Because in existentialism, there's an insistence, right, that in every human being, there's a representation of the whole of humanity. And in that sense, there's this sort of overwhelming, if you will, sense of dread, if you will, right, and responsibility that overwhelms the subject. So what Foucault says is be very careful with that, because how can the subject actually assume total responsibilities from their actions, right, or from its actions, if the subject does not have knowledge on how is it that it came into being, right? Yes. I would say that hopefully some of this work is such work. It's a contestation, right? But to sort of say that it is easy to escape the patriarchal, right, realm of signification, that would be, I think, misleading everybody. Yes?
I watched recently the film by the artist Banksy, Exit Through the Gift Shop. I don't know if you've seen it.
I have not.
But it focused on the rise of an individual who had no art training, but who was able to make a meteoric rise in the art world with the help of the media, with media assistance. And what role, my question to you is, what role do you think the media plays in the art world, and do you think the media has a responsibility in portraying certain art in a certain light?
Okay, so this is a really good question, okay? And it's a fantastic question, actually, because it addresses something that I was not able to address before. And that is the notion, right, or the association between art and market, right? That is something that the feminist movement also tried to disrupt and destabilize. So that the fact that women, for example, started doing performance work wasn't just because they wanted to do performance work. It was because it was not possible to commodify that. You know, you couldn't sort of go sell Faith Wilding's performance, right? It existed at one point in time in one place, right? So it could not be co-opted and brought into the market, the art market structure, which is what you're talking about, right? Which is essentially a bastion of masculinity, right? If you look, I mean, this is really scandalous. If you sort of take a toll, and I don't have the exact numbers, right, of the amount of men having one-man shows every year in New York City and the amount of women, you probably are in the single-digit percentile for women. Representation of women in the Museum of Modern Art, forget it. It's like, it's inconsequential, right? So I'm assuming that your artist is a male.
The street artists, both were males.
Of course, right? And that somehow they are sort of brought into, right, a gallery system that then packages, sort of markets it, and produces this sort of like mythology, again, right, of the creative male genius. And, right, because it's sort of like inherent in this, the idea of the artist then as an idiot savant, as somebody who really doesn't know what he's doing, right, or she's doing for that matter, is something that the market loves, right? Artists that think are problematic. They want to upset things, they want to question things, right, and they don't sell well. Yes?
Along those lines, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how identification as a feminist artist is detrimental or beneficial to, obviously, the
wonderful question.
Good for building an energy and producing work, but then, like you're just saying, if it ultimately pans out that very few women are able to support themselves.
Okay, this is a fantastic question. I hope that there's some artists in the audience, and because this is, I think, a really very important question. It is great for society. It is great for our culture, right? But women and people of color, if we think of it, and I don't know if you're in any way sort of familiar with like queer theory, right? For the queer domain, obviously, right, this is what it's all about, right? But the relationship between the queer domain and mainstream culture is definitely antagonistic. It's definitely oppositional, right? What does queer theory mean? Queer theory is something that emerges from feminist theory. And it's a huge umbrella of difference that encapsulates or covers, if you will, every aspect of difference that we can imagine, if you will, in the human experience, right? Lifestyle, sexuality, gender, etc., right? So in answering your question, I would say we need you if you're an artist and you sort of like have a position, right, that's going to sort of help us understand ourselves and better the position of the margin in relationship to the center. Absolutely, right? If you're talking, how is it that center, right, that center that where basically capital and power reside is going to perceive your challenge, it's not going to be pretty, right? You are going to fight your way towards this. And it can be done. I mean, there's very successful, right, feminist artists that have been able to sort of like move through, if you will, from the periphery onto the center, right, and be successful in every sense of the word. The exception more than the rule, right? However, right, and this is what I love to tell my students, you don't have to sort of pander to the market. You don't have to pander to the gallery establishment. You can be an artist and you can teach It's an honorable thing, right? It's not a bad thing. You work with young artists. You can sort of actually do something that makes a difference, right? You can actually have a life, right? You don't have to be like a star in order for you to sort of feel that you're a successful artist. As a matter of fact, I would say that probably the amount of successful artists to the amount of like not successful artists is like, infinitesimal, right? I mean, it's like winning the lottery. Yes.
So as far as this art helping, I guess my question is as far as actually breaking out of these realms of patriarchy, etc., how does this kind of art, feminist art, queer art, etc., really then go about bringing social change?
Great question as well. And I should say that there's different sort of like levels of engagement, right? And primarily two levels of engagement. One of them is critique, okay, which is essentially, I think, what we're sort of seeing in terms of Nikki as Lee, right? It's a critique of a situation, right? A different thing, and this is a really difficult thing to get at, is actually intervention, okay, where actually the artist seeks to transform a social condition. For example, Sabrosa, a collective organized by Faith Wilding and her peers, are very much involved with reproductive technologies. And so what they do is they research and they produce literature and they produce pamphlets and they go into women's clinics and they go into community centers and they educate women, if you will, right, in relationship to reproductive technologies and the monstrous, if you will, apparatus, right, that resides behind those reproductive technologies, right, that misrepresent, if you will, desire or create desire in relation, or cosmetic, if you will, for example, surgeries, things of this sort. So there's very specific, the biggest one, right, and is perhaps, and I'm going to step outside of the realm of feminist work, for example, right, but still within the realm of the other. If it were not for artists in the 1980s, during the Reagan administration, AIDS would have never been sort of like addressed as a pandemic that eventually it had to be. Right? It was essentially artists that engaged into the disruption of everyday life in major urban areas and in major institutions that eventually forced the hand of the Reagan administration, which basically sort of said, it's homosexuals, right? It's like it's their sort of like it is their problem, right? It's God's punishment, right? So. Particularly in our which what I'm saying is, yes, there is a moment where the artist can engage into an interventionist, right? And this is a beautiful, by the way, catalog for a show that happened at MASMOCA about 10 years ago. It's titled The Interventionist, and it's a survey of individuals and collectives doing this type of work. So artists working in education is a huge thing these days as well. I'm afraid I've kept you way too long. I love the subjects. I'm sorry, I'm overly enthusiastic. Thank you for coming, and I hope you